Hello, my name is Charles C., and I'm a student in Cyber Physical Systems in 2019. And the paper I'm presenting on is FBS radar uncovering fake base stations at scale in the wild. This paper was presented at the Network and Distributed Systems Security Symposium in 2017. The link to the paper is at the bottom, and pardon my pronunciation, the authors are Zhenhua Li, Weiwei Wang, Christo Wilson, Jian Chen, Chen Qian, Taeho Jung, Lan Zhang, Kebin Liu, Xiangyang Li, and Yunhao Liu. So the purpose of the paper was to talk about a vulnerability in the GSM protocol, which is commonly referred to as the 2G network. And it does not require authorization of the base station, otherwise known as a cell phone tower, in order to connect. So criminal gangs actually, more commonly, are using this vulnerability to create fake cell phone towers. And the paper goes on to discuss how the criminals are using these fake base stations to send unsolicited text messages from spoofed numbers to directly attack cell phone users. They found that there are 5 different metrics for identifying these fake base stations and being able to tell the difference between a fake base station and a real base station based on these metrics. And then they talk about how you can geolocate the fake base stations using cell phones without sacrificing user privacy and having a negligible impact on the end user's devices. So the vulnerability that the paper's authors and the designers of the FBS radar were trying to address is the fact that the 2G or GSM protocol doesn't require the devices, most of the time cell phones, to authenticate the base station before it connects. And one would think that, well, that's only going to affect cell phones that use 2G, and most new cell phones use 3G or 4G, but in fact, most current devices support 2G, 3G, and 4G networks. So current cell phones are susceptible to this vulnerability, and there are talks of phasing out 2G, but that takes a long time and we're not there yet, so current devices are vulnerable to this. What the attackers can do is they can create their own high-strength GSM protocol cell phone tower, and because the signal is so strong, cell phones will connect to it. But if the criminals want to give themselves an even better chance of having nearby devices connect to their fake base station, they can send out jamming signals, which forces the devices into GSM mode and prevents them from using 3G and 4G and only lets them use 2G. So these FBSes have been found all around the world, not just in third world countries or anything. They've been found in China, in the US, India, Russia, Israel, and the UK. So it's a big problem and they're widespread. The creating the fake base stations and having users connect to them allows the attacker to send spoofed text messages. And because they have control over the cell phone tower, they can use numbers that are usually reserved for government agencies and cell phone networks, things like that, in order to solicit private information or in general perform fraudulent activity against the users. So the main type of attack that's perpetrated by these criminal organizations who use fake base stations is a phishing attack. And what that is it's a type of cybercrime where you pretend to be a trusted institution, like a bank or a government agency or a public service, and you use the trust that people have in those agencies to extract personal information from them that they would otherwise not want to give you, like credit card numbers or social security numbers, things like that. And these phishing attacks through text messages are becoming more and more of a problem. In fact, in 2013, in China alone, users received 2.7 billion fraudulent or spam messages, and then in 2014, that number grew to 4.2 billion, and in 2015, the number grew to 5.7 billion. So, as you can tell, the issue of fraudulent text messages is getting much worse, in no small part due to these fake base station attacks. And the main reason why the fake base station attacking is so popular with these criminal organizations is because it can be very lucrative. In fact, an attacker with a $700 fake base station, which you can fit in your car, can make upwards of $1,400 per day using these phishing techniques. So the way these base stations work is that they're basically made of three simple components: a GSM wireless transceiver, a laptop, and a cell phone. And basically what the wireless transceiver is it consists of a motherboard, a power supply, an antenna, a power amplifier, and a radio frequency duplexer. And out of curiosity, I looked, and this is the core component of the fake base station, is this wireless transceiver. Out of curiosity, I looked on the internet to see how hard it is to find one of these, and it's actually extremely easy. I mean, you literally can just Google it, and it's like pops up right away. So it's not a hard thing to get. And the way you use it is you hook a laptop up to it via USB cable, and that allows you to configure the different settings on the GSM transceiver in order to better duplicate a legitimate cell phone tower. You can change things like the base station ID, the radio frequency you're using, the signal strength, things like that, so that the devices in the area are more likely to connect to your fake base station instead of the legitimate base stations in the surrounding area. The question remains, though, how do you find out what settings to use on your wireless transceiver? What settings do you use your laptop to set your transceiver to? And that's where the cell phone comes in. You can use the cell phone to scan the nearby legitimate base stations, record all the wireless parameters that they have set, and then change your base station to better mock the legitimate one. In some ways you want it the same, in some ways you want it different. For example, your base station should have a different location area code than the legitimate one, because when someone's cell phone enters your fake base station's area of influence, it needs to think that it's in a different cell phone location area. Because if it's only slightly different, most cell phones will just hang on to the connection they already have because they don't want to switch, because that costs a lot of power. But if it's called an LAC code, if your location area code is different enough, once it notices that and it sees, oh, I'm in a different location, it'll switch to yours, which is, as an attacker, which is what you want. And you also want it to have a legitimate BS identifier, which you can get from the legitimate base stations around the area. And you want your signal strength to be much higher than the legitimate base stations, so that the devices prefer your signal over theirs. So now that we have talked about what fake base stations are, I'd like to talk about how the authors of the paper came up with a system with which to identify whether the text messages coming in were from fake base stations or legitimate ones. And what they did was they had many users opt into a data collection process, and then they did data analysis on messages that they deemed to be suspicious. And a suspicious message for them was defined as a message coming from someone who was not in their contacts list, or a message coming from someone using an authoritative number, like something from a bank or a public service, like we talked about earlier. And what they found was that the suspicious messages that were highly likely to have been sent from fake base stations had the following characteristics. Firstly, they had unreasonably high signal strength. So, like we said before, the attackers want to have very high signal strength so that the cell phone will pick your fake tower over the legitimate one, and they found that these messages were coming from a signal strength that was much higher than would ever be reasonable in a normal setting. Secondly, the messages were coming from base stations that just straight up had invalid base station IDs, that the syntax of the ID didn't match anything that could be a valid one. The suspicious messages were coming from those authoritative numbers, and the message content itself failed a check against a bag of words classifier, where they have words to check the message contents against. If enough of them match up, they know it's probably not a legitimate message. And what's important about this metric is that this overlaps with the other metrics about 98% of the time. And what that means is if you have, say, if you have the first, fourth, and fifth metric matched, you don't even need the third metric to match because it overlaps so often. And that's really important because that means that in order to detect a fake base station, you don't need to be programmatically checking the contents of the text message, and that helps preserve the privacy of the end user. The fourth metric is that the messages were sent from what looked like a legitimate base station, had a valid base station ID and everything, but the base station wasn't in the correct location in the world. It was what they did was they were spoofing a real base station, but just bringing it where they currently were instead of it being from the base station far away in a different geolocation. And the fifth metric is a little confusing. It's similar to the fourth metric, where the base stations were still in the wrong geolocation, but the difference is the way they determined the geolocation. So for when available, when the wireless access point location data was available, they could determine the location of the correct location of the base station through that. But when that wasn't available, what they did was they used the base station handover speed, how fast the data was being transferred, to determine the geolocation. And in those cases, they were still in the wrong spot geographically. So the majority of the paper talks about a tool that the authors developed, which is a fake base station detection system, and it's called FBS radar. So I want to introduce that now. It has four main goals, and the first of which is to detect as many fake base stations as possible with few false positives. But not only that, it wants to be able to accomplish that with basically no insight into the criminal's current activities, and also they don't want to have any specialized hardware. We don't want the the user's cell phone to have to be rooted or anything like that. It needs to be general hardware with very little what they refer to as ground truth about the criminals themselves. The second goal is to automatically filter the spam and the fraudulent text messages sent by the fake base stations from the user's cell phone. So people who have this installed on their device would not even receive the text message at all, which would protect the user themselves. The third goal is to aid law enforcement, and to do this, they need to provide actual intelligence about where the base stations are currently, and in that way they can help the police find and disable these fake cell towers. And then lastly, they want to use as few resources on the user's device as possible, and the point of that is to encourage adoption of the FBS radar so that people feel comfortable using it, that it's not going to bog down their device. And as you can see from the FBS radar timeline, they spent about 2 years developing this, and they already have around 32 million suspicious text messages reported every single day. The paper goes into very specific and technical details about how the FBS radar works and how fake base stations work, and while it's extremely interesting and I highly recommend you read it, it's too much to cover here in this short presentation. But what I want to do is give you an overview of how the FBS radar detects and blocks suspicious messages that are most likely from fake base stations. So FBS radar is part of an app, a Chinese app called Baidu PhoneGuard. It's a component of that, and it leverages the PhoneGuard platform in order to get the user reports, get the messages reported, do the analysis, and perform the necessary steps to block the message. So when a user opts into the data collection, their suspicious messages start getting automatically forwarded to FBS radar for analysis, and the message is first checked. The phone number from the message is first checked against a authoritative phone number list. So it's a big list of all the messages from banks and public services and things like that that are from legitimate institutions. And if it is from an authoritative number, then it's met one of our metrics. The second step is to compare the location of the base station against the location of legitimate base stations. If the location of the base station does not match a legitimate one, then that's a big red flag that it's a fake base station. Fourthly, they take the Wi-Fi MAC address and then they map it to an actual location using a location database that they maintain, and to determine the user's location, and then they compare the user's location to the base station location, and if the user is outside of the base station's reported area of influence, the amount of coverage that the cell phone tower is supposed to have, if the user is outside of that, then they know that the base station is in the wrong spot geographically and therefore is most likely fake. And finally, if it meets enough of the metrics, then it is determined to be delivered from a fake cell phone tower and is blocked by the user. As you can see from the architectural overview, the user report first goes into the content-free analysis and gets compared against the different databases and gets stored in the message logs. The messages themselves don't get stored in the message logs. It's just the information about the base station location and the MAC address from the Wi-Fi and stuff like that. It's not the actual text message. And then it moves on to the content analysis. But as I was saying before, the content analysis, where they would actually look at the content of the message, isn't necessary to determine whether the message is from a fake base station or not. So they're actually phasing out all of the content analysis portion of the FBS radar because it is because not having the content analysis protects the privacy of the end user much more. In conclusion, the paper shows that fake base stations and fraudulent messages in general are becoming a worse and worse problem as time goes on. The number of spam messages received by users has grown by millions within the last few years. Also, the fake base stations themselves are getting more sophisticated. When it used to fit in a van, it now fits in a backpack, which makes locating and disrupting the base stations a harder task than before. In order to combat this, FBS radar has been working to become highly effective. It can be used at scale because it doesn't require any specialized hardware. It works on generic iPhone and Android devices, which allows millions and millions of users to use it. Currently, they have around 92 million users using the FBS radar, which goes to show that it is also widely used. Lastly, the FBS radar doesn't only detect if a message is sent from a fraudulent cell phone tower, but it also can detect the location of the fake base station and help authorities shut them down. So they're not only helping to protect users from getting the message in the first place, but they're also helping the police to find and disable the fake base stations once and for all.